and I'm the director of DurhamCares, also a member at Untitled Chapter. I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm also, I first heard of Jonathan, by Jonathan, that was written 12 or 13 years ago. One of his earlier books that wasn't mentioned in that long list of books, and a book about racial justice and reconciliation. And a lot of my reason for coming to Durham was getting to know Jonathan and seeing what Jonathan was doing, and seeing you continue to
glad you came to Durham, and I'm glad for the work we're doing, and I'm grateful to be with a friend. Let me just say, you mentioned that book, that I wrote that book in many ways because I had the gift of learning from what I called in that book the Mount Level School of Theology. Many of the teachers of that school have scattered from this place, from their teaching folks at Duke Divinity School to other places around the world since that time. But they were there because of the life and teaching ministry of Dr. Turner. And so I'm so grateful to Mount Level for forming this partnership and for all that your church has been about. As long before I came to Durham, you have plowed long in good soil, and I'm grateful for that ministry.
And yes, this is being recorded. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, Jonathan's most recent book is Revolution of Values, and Jonathan, this was published in 2019 at a time that the conversation about Christian nationalism, religious right, is a very relevant topic. It has not ceased to be relevant, and we have seen its relevance even within the last couple of months. So, talk a little bit about the current landscape and how Christian nationalism, religious right, is part of what we're seeing right now in our current landscape.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's an important conversation for us to be having. A question?
Can you turn up your sound?
We need to turn up the mic. I can't, but I think our brother up here can. So I can holler. You know,
Thank you.
I'm an old Baptist revivalist. We can do this outside if we need to. But, I'll try to speak up, and I think we can figure it out. As Reynolds noted, we're gathered to talk about the challenge of Christian nationalism, which is very much before us and has been for some time. I published this book right at the end of 2019. Actually, the first thing I did in 2020, go to New York City, and we had a conference around this theme with people who were thinking and talking about this at the time. Shortly after which, I came home and the pandemic hit, and everything else I've been through was canceled. Nevertheless, the topic did not go away, and especially since the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, I think the news media has begun to pay attention to this reality because of the fact that people who went to the Capitol prepared to violently overthrow the processes of the democracy were very obviously carrying Christian Jesus on them and the like. And of course, just this summer, we have seen the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court, which overturned Roe v. Wade, and in many ways is the named goal of the whole movement that led to this culture that we call Christian nationalism now. So what I wanted to do with this book, and what I've been trying to do since, is to help Christians understand the very large and well-funded campaign that took 4 decades to create this culture in order to hijack my faith and yours. Very intentional and well-planned campaign, and very well-funded. We can get into details of that. But on the other hand, if this culture that has been built and all of the organizational infrastructure of it is designed to hijack Christianity, I think Christians in particular, and I'll say as a Christian of the lighter tone variety in this country, white Christians especially, have a responsibility to publicly challenge Christian nationalism. Because while this has always been a minority movement and still is, its disproportionate influence has depended on the fact that many people who disagree with it haven't been all that vocal publicly about offering an alternative to it. So, Revolution of Values is a book that tries to do two things. It might try to do too much in one little book. What it tries to do is both give the history of how this came to be and, at the same time, describe the faith-rooted movements that offer a concrete alternative way of being Christian in public. Because that's what we've got to figure out in this moment. It will not be enough to expose and debunk Christian nationalism. I'm glad we're having the January 6th commission. I'm glad people are watching the hearings. Yes, crimes were committed. I don't know how far they'll go with prosecuting those crimes. But anybody who watches it will see that at the root of this is something more than the actors who can be charged with crimes. At the root of it is a whole network of organizations and a culture that created the possibility of thousands of people believing that God was calling them to storm the Capitol of the United States. And until we offer a concrete alternative to that culture, and we got to get detailed about what it actually looks like, because the structure of it has been targeted at particular areas where even the people who don't like it don't have many institutions or gatherings to go to that aren't influenced by it. You see? And so this is the largest church in democracy in America right now. And because it is, I think the church has responsibility to address it. So briefly, that's where I'm at.
It's a good start.
All right, thanks.
So tell us about that history. Not all of us have read the book. What is the story about religious right, as you said, hijacked our faith?
Well, so one of the ways I tell the story is by telling my own story, because I grew up in this. I was born in 1980 on a Saturday in November, and the next morning, actually my dad was very delighted that after my mother's labor, I had been born soon enough on Saturday that he was able to call over to the church house so they could announce my birth on Sunday morning at the Mount Olive Baptist Church where they were members. And it was the first Sunday after Ronald Reagan had elected. So that's when I was born. And if we rewind the tape of both American Christianity and American history to that point, that is the moment when what is now called the religious right sort of made its debut on the public stage. People began to realize that there was an organized effort to politicize particularly white Southern Christians into a coalition that would help elect Ronald Reagan. They called it the religious right, and the organization that was doing the work in that campaign was called the moral majority. I think it's important for people to understand that the moral majority, while its public face was certainly Jerry Falwell and other Southern preachers, it was largely organized in terms of being envisioned and put within a coalition that would give it political power by a man named Paul Weyrich. And Paul Weyrich was a political operative of what was called the New Right in the 1970s. And Weyrich's concern, along with many others like him, was that there were seismic changes in the political landscape of the United States that had happened, particularly in the latter 60s and early 70s, that were shifting the calculus of where you could go to build a base for a majority in this country, which is what you need because we have a two-party system, right? And so as a political operative on the right, he was particularly concerned with building a political base for the Republican Party. There was an advisor to Richard Nixon named Kevin Phillips who had done some pretty careful mapping, and Kevin Phillips understood that just demographically, the base that would vote for Republicans was very white. It was not, of course, the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights movement, the voting rights movement, and the equal rights amendment collectively had created this crisis. And so there was, and there were factions within conservatism that were certainly outside of the Republican Party. This is '68 is when George Wallace went in for president as the third party candidate. And one of the things Kevin Phillips noticed when Wallace ran was that this Southern governor who had become famous for being a segregationist was actually very popular with white people in the suburbs of the big city. He had 30,000 people, I think, show up at New York for his rally there. And so Phillips began to talk about a coalition that he said would spread from the south to the suburbs and across the Sun Belt, and would be a base for what he understood indirectly that it would be a white base. Well, Wyrick understood this too, and Wyrick understood that in the post-civil rights America, you could not organize people around their race, right? That was where Wallace had failed. He had become nationally known as the guy who said segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation forever. That was his opening speech when he became governor of Alabama. So Wyrick understood that race was not going to be a way to organize white people. So his big question was, how can you organize white voters without appealing to their races, without appealing to their racial identity? And his answer, it turned out, was religion, or what he began calling traditional values. He understood that for so many, particularly Southern white people at that time, what they called their way of life was so tied up with how they understood God and understood religion that you could begin to talk to people in a kind of almost coded way. Lee Atwater later talked about how the new right talked about these things in other coded languages. It wasn't religious, like forced busing. Right? Forced busing was a way of talking about the Brown decision without actually talking about the Brown decision. So religion became a way that Wyrick saw that he could unite people without directly losing the race. And here's the thing, it took several years and several failures, actually, to get the right issue. Because Wyrick tried several things that didn't work. He couldn't quite get, you see, a lot of white fundamentalists and evangelicals were largely apolitical. They believed, as they had been taught for generations, many of them, that the fundamental reality that the church was concerned about was the salvation of souls, and that that meant that God was going to take you to heaven if you died, and whatever was going to happen to the world, you know, most folks believed that it was just going to burn up, whether it was, you know, before a millennium or after a millennium, whatever's going to happen to this whole world. It didn't have a lot to do with the church's priorities, so they didn't get too involved in politics. Except these were white Southern people, and in the defiance of the Brown decision, many of these white Southerners had said, we don't want our children going to school with those children. You understand what this means, right? When Brown says desegregated schools, white folks said, you know, Virginia had, this is where Jerry Falwell got involved, Virginia had a campaign called Massive Resistance. Massive Resistance shut down the public schools of Virginia. For months, white people said, we just won't have school if our kids have to go to school with black kids. And Jerry Falwell was politicized by that. That's his first political act. He joined as chaplain the what they call Sovereignty Commission, the local Sovereignty Commission of his part of Virginia in the midst of that campaign. Well, Wyrick saw that those churches like Falwell's that had gotten involved in that way were using their tax-exempt status in order to run what they call but were essentially segregation academies. They could pull their kids out of the public schools, they could send their kids to all white schools by sending them to school at their church, where of course no black person would ever want to go to church, so they didn't worry about it, right? This was we had gotten beyond, you know, desegregating churches. These were churches that no black people would ever be part of. So they were doing their own thing, and they were running these academies. And what happened in the Carter administration was the Justice Department and the IRS, in terms of enforcing civil rights legislation, began to crack down on these places and say, if you're going to have that nonprofit status, you've got to abide by federal law. wrong. So if you don't, not only if you don't admit Black Rose, but if you don't even make any effort to be a school for the whole community, then you can't be a nonprofit organization. Well, this made those churches extremely angry. And Wyrick, the political operative, said, this is a great opportunity. Here's our chance to get these folks fired up and get them involved. But here, I mean, I'll have to give it to the brother. He was a bit brilliant in this way. He said, they're already fired up. Let's not make it about the academies. Let's make it about something that no one can be against. Let's make it about life, right? So there have been historians like Randall Walmer and others who've done work on this. But basically, over a few years, Wyrick was able to work with influential, largely evangelical pastors to really change the conversation about the Roe decision, which had been 5 years earlier by this point, in order to say that we are a coalition of people who believe in traditional values, who believe in biblical values. We're going to vote for life. But what that means when we vote for life is we're voting for reactionary conservatives who are against women's rights and against civil rights and against all the changes that have been happening in the country since the sort of legislative wins of the civil and women's rights movements. So that's the origins of what we now call the religious right. And, none of that history takes away from the still very complicated issues around, life and decisions that people make, when they learn that they're pregnant, later in the pregnancy, when they learn that there's problems with pregnancy, all those things, very complicated issues. Right? So I'm not weighing in on any of that here. I'm simply saying this is the history of how the political operatives recognize here's an issue that we can push, we can bring people together, build a culture that doesn't force us to talk explicitly about race, but will keep this coalition together. And that is the work that this network has been doing for 40 years. And that is the network that when the Dobbs decision came down, said, we have won the victory that they always said that they would win. Because they knew from the very beginning that that was not a majority opinion, right? It's still not a majority opinion. Most people did not want to overturn Roe. But they were able to win political power by talking about pro-life politicians, pro-life issues, and building on this culture. So that's the word.
Well, tell us a little bit about how it has evolved over the years and how it kind of brings us to where we are right now.
Yeah. Well, it's a long story, and I think it's one we should pay attention to because this is a movement that had to keep learning and had to keep figuring out how they could build a bigger base. By the 1990s, for example, this movement that has its origins in what I think can fairly be called, a reaction against the civil rights movement. Its chief operative is not Paul Wyrick, it's a guy named Ralph Reed. And Ralph Reed is stealing language directly from Jesse Jackson and talking about how the pro-life movement has to build a rainbow coalition, right? And he's intentionally reaching out and bringing in Catholics. He's intentionally reaching out and bringing in Pentecostals. He wants, a direct appeal to Hispanic communities and to Black communities around these values, right, that have been named and that have built a kind of culture, and that he understands is separated enough from race, as most of us understand it, that you can embrace it whatever your race, right? And so you have me here in North Carolina. We have a Black lieutenant governor who is all in on this culture. I mean, every talking point the brother has is straight out of this anti-civil rights movement. But I'm not saying that the man's not Black. I'm just saying that it's been made a movement that is, fully embraceable by anyone who buys into the language. So the question becomes, and I think this is probably the biggest part of the development, is how were they able to build such a cogent and a culture that has, for a culture to be powerful, it has to echo in enough places that you don't feel crazy when you're part of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's not easy to do that, right? Because if you hear somebody somewhere telling you something, and then you go to 3 other places, and people say, that's weird, then you begin to think, well, that might be a cult, right? That's something strange. Right? But if you can go in there and hear something and then you hear it repeated in 3 or 4 places, then you come back, maybe there was fraud in the 2020. Right? Maybe the liberals are stealing babies and, taking children into a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., or, whatever the story is this week. These are real stories I'm telling you. People believe them. But people believe them because they heard them repeated by people they trusted. And what Weyrich understood, again, I think very brilliantly as an organizer, is you can only do that with coordinated organization. So at the same time he was reaching out to Falwell to form a moral majority, he also formed something called the Council for National Policy. And the Council for National Policy became a roundtable where organizations that had shared political aims, namely the success of the Republican Party with their shared political aims, then would coordinate their efforts, not just to win elections, but to win cultural battles. This is where we got what the sociologists at UVA call the culture wars. It's kind of become a standard way of naming this. From early on, members of that coalition included the Republican Party, as things like the moral majority and other Christian ministries that would repeat this, but also, from the very beginning, the NRA, part of this, independent media organizations that have grown incredibly. I mean, you're familiar with the media organization that another Richard Nixon, not Kevin Phillips, but Roger Ailes founded, Fox News, certainly became the most widely watched version of this. But the influence of this network has been that organizations like Fox News were always coordinating through this council with American Family Radio, which owns most Christian radio in the country, another network called Lot Radio, which is a local radio station. And then these folks who own these media companies began buying up local papers as the local newspapers in rural areas were struggling in the media market. And so Ann Nelson, who's a scholar at Columbia in New York, she wrote a book on the Council of National Policy called The Shadow Network. In her book, she talks about what the council was able to do over 40 years as building a wraparound culture in predominantly white and rural communities in the country, because they knew politically those were the places they needed to win. So if they could get the preacher saying something on Sunday that resonated with what the radio said when you were riding the tractor out in the field, that resonated with what the politicians said when they came through every 2 years, 4 years, to rally up their base, then you had a culture that could really hold people together. And that's the organizational heft really behind Christian nationalism, and why, again, despite the best efforts of our Congress right now and the best efforts of lots of good journalists who tried to show that this or that, you can't fact check a culture, is what I'm saying. There's no amount of telling people that there's no basis for this or that claim if they've already bought the whole story. And in fact, not only bought it, but they live by the whole story. It is the only story in town in many other places that this network is targeted. So that's the challenge we're up against. When I say Christian nationalism is the biggest challenge in democracy, I don't just mean that you have to somehow debunk this in public. I suspect most of you who are here today probably didn't come in believing most of Christian nationalism. So we're not going to do much debunking here anyway. But even if we did, the bigger thing is for people who are in this, who believe it, for whom it is American history and it is the key battle in the United States today, what alternative do they have to go to? That's the big question, right? If you live out in, you don't have to go too far from Durham. If you live just out in the county somewhere in North Carolina, and this has been, the local culture for all of your life. It's that's the challenge we face. How do we build a new narrative and a new set of values that ties our faith? I think it has to be faith-based because it's been so focused on Christian communities, so that ties our Christian faith to the values that have made democracy possible, or at least an experiment toward democracy possible in this country, which is, a commitment to a common good, a commitment to a public life, a commitment to institutions that share responsibility for, things that individuals can't figure out on their own. Big problems like healthcare or a climate crisis. We live in Durham. Durham's a great community. I love, a lot of our local culture here. And it's entirely clear to me, just as a very practical matter, that the biggest things we're struggling with in this community right now are not things that we can address at a local level, right? We have a crisis of housing affordability, a crisis of access to health care. This is the thing I run into every day. So people who probably your church too, people come to our church, they can't afford to live. Well, there's not a county funded program big enough to address that, right? I mean, these are big issues that we're going to have to face on a larger scale. That makes it a political question, which means there has to be a base to support it. So that's kind of in a very practical way where my interest in the church offering an alternative to Christianity.
Yeah, I'm struck by how powerful, as you narrated, Christian nationalism is in the face of the church, which is called to shape us and form our imagination, form our culture. It sounds like it's just been so powerful that our church to resist that, and just how it influences our moral imagination. You talked about the Rainbow Coalition and kind of building that base, and one of the things that we're seeing now is that movement is pushing back against things like voting rights, critical race theory, and so there are very specific things about it that are doing things that are harming African Americans, people of color. So how has this religious right kind of taken stage now with the kind of push against race theory, voting rights, things like that?
Yeah. So I should say, to clarify what I said earlier, that while this movement has always been aware that it could not be explicitly racist, it has also been aware that it needed racist people, and it never wanted to alienate racist people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that is something they've always tried to hold on. And I think the movement has also always been aware that its primary political goals have been to counter the influence of the civil rights movement. So while, and again, I'm not accusing these people of hating anyone. I'm not saying they're doing it because, they look at their black neighbor or their brown neighbor and say, I want to get those people. I'm saying that they genuinely believe that the gains of the civil rights movement were detrimental to their vision of what the country should be. So in that sense, there's nothing new about the anti-black policies and anti-black tactics of the movement. They've always been there, and the movement has always been careful to try to make them look not racist. But then that's the story of racism in America and in our world. This is what Brother Ibram Kendi teaches ever so clearly, and I think that's why people come at him so hard. He's a historian, and he says, racist people have always been not racist. that's racist people have always said, what we want is what's best for everyone. Right? That's what every plantation owner says. Every plantation owner, when confronted about the fact that he claimed to own other human beings, said, they're better in my household than they would be anywhere else. Every preacher of slaveholder religion said, if they hadn't been brought here, they wouldn't have heard the gospel. Isn't it good? Right? So people who embody and defend racism are always not racist. Right? They always think that what they're doing is the best for everyone. So that is this movement, and I think especially since 2020 and the widespread public embrace of a movement that affirmed Black lives and called for racial justice. Now, again, that's not a movement that's new. I mean, people have been trying to say that Black Lives Matter for as long as folks have been calling people black, right? So that's not new. But in 2020, because of a lot of years of organizing and because of, frankly, just the circumstances of George Floyd's very public murder in the street and the reaction to that, there was a huge, at least shift in public opinion polls and in people's willingness to say the word Black Lives Matter. And that really scared this coalition, because this coalition always depends on the racial fears of their mostly white base and has consistently appealed to those, again, often not explicitly, but in ways that they know will fire people up. So their response to that immediately was to ask, okay, how do we, I'm not saying this is the language they use, but I think this is the basic goal. How do we scare our base back into dependence on us, right? Because there were Southern Baptist preachers. The head of the Southern Baptist Convention in 2020 was a pastor from this community. He pastored the Summit Church. And the head of the Southern Baptist Church at the time, I think because it was the consensus of not only his congregation, but the country, he made a statement. He said, Black Lives Matter. Okay. If even the head of the Southern Baptist Church is saying Black Lives Matter, it's pretty mainstream. So he said that. And immediately, again, the folks who are trying to control this base and are using often racial fear to do that said, oh, we've got to do something. Like this is dangerous. We could lose control. And so they began to look for ways to suggest that work for racial justice is somehow anti-biblical, is somehow against these quote unquote traditional values that they know their base shared. And they did that in a sort of weird way, but I can't say that it hasn't worked for them, for their base, because this is spread by looking pretty deep into the sort of world of reflection on racial justice and how it can become a reality in American life. And there was a law professor at Harvard named Derek Bell, who was a civil rights lawyer before he went to teach at Harvard. And when he was there, he began to develop what's usually called in legal circles critical race theory. It applies critical theory to the story of racial justice in the 20th century, and actually says, what the theory says, is that there are systemic challenges to racial justice that even the legislation of the civil rights movement did not overcome. So this is someone who has worked for civil rights, who has become somewhat cynical about the capacity of at least just a law or two to change the long history of the country. Seems like an odd place for these folks to look, but they were drawing on some of their sort of more philosophical folks who had thought that critical theory could be. These are the same people who were questioning postmodernism 25 years ago. I don't know if you ever heard those conversations. Postmodernism questioning whether reality is something that can be known. If you can't know truth, then how can we ever worship a God who is truth? Postmodernism must be anti-God. If you ever heard those conversations, there was a whole thing around that. But anyway, same kind of thing. They said, well, critical theory is being defined, and maybe what critical race theory is something that says that your race is actually determinative of who you are. And so, you can't be a child of God, you can't be redeemable, you're destined by your race. So what they started to do, these critical race theory people are trying to promote a vision of the world that is anti-Christian. And so what you have to do is you have to resist critical race theory in schools, even though it's not in common schools. You have to resist critical race theory, which means you have to resist any efforts for racial justice in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and a public embrace of Black Lives Matter, because now that people are actually talking about, well, what would racial justice look like in a congregation, what would it look like in a school, what would it look like in a community, then we're going to have to say that's dangerous to you.
Right.
That's not going to work.
And history too, teaching history.
Yeah, and so, just history that doesn't even engage in the critical legal part of that, but just says, hey, we was enslaving people for a long time, then we Jim Crowed, then we did a new Jim Crow, now we're gentrifying the neighborhoods and, pushing them into poverty. Like, that's a long story that seems to be targeted at the same people. I mean, draw what you will from the facts, but that's history. So you have, they've used this, and again, used the network. It gives people the language, and then it already has politicians in place in the legislature in Texas who can present a list of 800 books that he said were promoting critical race theory and that should be banned. And now you got, folks who listen to the radio show. And again, I'm not saying that these are like conspiratorial people. A lot of them are just people who they're plumbers or they're, they run the local hardware store. They listen to the radio at work during the day. They say, I can't believe they're trying to do this to our kids. Let's go down to the library tonight and make sure they don't have any of these books on the shelves. Because it's what they heard on the radio. It's what they heard from the, free maker they get in their mailbox. And unfortunately, in many other communities, it's either what they hear from their preacher or they don't hear their preacher saying anything else. Right?
Talk a little bit about that. You talked about how, part of the problem is that there's not an alternative voice to this. And, sometimes the reaction is to be completely on the other side, and sometimes the reaction is, I'm not going to talk about politics, but talk about how we can have a response.
Well, so this has to do, just this question of how you respond, I think the answer to that is why we have minority control of the government in the country right now. That's true at the federal level, and I think it's somewhat true here in the state. And it's a result of this kind of organizing that we've been talking about being met by, again, good-hearted people, well-meaning people, many of us, frankly, who in our churches say, well, the church has a long tradition of trying to be a place that proclaims good news to everybody. And if you're going to proclaim good news to everybody, then you obviously can't take sides in the sort of, debates that the normal debates that people have. And I get that, I think there's good reasons why the church, stays out of partisan politics. I am a Baptist. I happen to believe in the separation of church and state because, folks like Roger Williams and John Leland thought that was important and got it into the Constitution of the United States because the Puritans, with all apologies to any Reformed folks who might be in the room, the Puritans decided that the Baptists were so wrong that they should use the power of the state to relocate them and kill them. So, that being the case, I'm all for the separation of church and state. I think it came for good reason. And I'm all for churches saying, look, when you're in the midst of debating the best way to say, deliver city and county services to folks in your community, there's probably, legitimate debate to be had. There's probably some on quote unquote both sides. So let's give and take, let's be a place that welcomes everybody from there. That's been our tradition. The reason that has not worked against this movement is that this has always been a minority movement that that understood that its main goal was to use the faith in particular to hold on to power and to give people a narrative that would shape their reality in such a way that it would demonize the other side. So, in a tradition where people have, for good reasons, tried to be nonpartisan and tried to, not directly connect the church to state in any official way, we have what has become, at least for one party, a state religion, and a state religion that is willing to not only demonize, quote unquote, the other side, but also demonize truth. That is just facts, right? Things that don't fit the narrative then become, slander and lies and fake news that are being thrown at you in order to deceive you. And so now, the political vision and the cultural narrative that surrounds it has itself become a matter of faith. And here's where I think this is pretty important too. If your primary belief is in the cultural narrative that this organizational network has given you in order to have political control, then I think quite directly in the language of Scripture, you've been invited to worship a false God, right? They're asking you to make it your primary faith, right? Don't believe what you see. Don't believe the evidence. Don't believe the journalists. Don't believe the facts. Believe what we're saying. Well, that's faith. I know enough about faith to know that faith is believing in spite of the evidence. Which, in any faith tradition, you have to do sometimes because we're talking about ultimate realities that can't be proven on the number of faith. But if you turn a political movement into a faith test, then I think the church has to, in order to bear witness to the reality of the faith tradition that we've inherited, we have to say, no, that's not Christianity. I'm not saying you can't be Christian and be a Republican. I'm saying you can't be Christian and trust by faith that everything that the religious right and the Republican Party tells you is true. That's right. And frankly, that's where we are right now. I think unless Christians who care about the common good are willing to link up with, frankly, all of our neighbors who are not Christian, whether they're our Jewish neighbors, our Muslim neighbors, our secular neighbors, whoever it is that for whatever their reasons believes in democracy, unless we're willing to hook up with them and say, we want to build a shared culture for the common good, we need a revolution of values, right? This is Dr. King's language. If there's a tradition that has hijacked values language in order to direct, a minority movement to overturn the democracy, there has to be a majority movement that will offer a moral narrative that tells Christian people, for us in the church, that tells Christian people how you can be a faithful Christian and work for the common good in public life. And I think that's what is missing in so many of our communities, and what will take a coordinated effort to build.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. One of the pieces of what you're sharing that really struck me in this book was the story about somebody who was resisting, I forgot the name, but it was someone who was resisting abolitionism, and said, we want to drive the abolitionists to separate. Could you share a little bit about that and how how far back this way of pushing people, Christians, away from this values?
Well, it was Robert Louis Dabney was his name. He had been a chaplain to the Confederate during the Civil War, and he continued to be a professor in the Presbyterian Seminary after the Civil War. But Dabney, in the lead up to the Civil War, he writes this in a letter, sort of strategic conversation about how does a slave supporting Presbyterian stand with the slaveholding regime of the South over and against the abolitionists, who frankly had a pretty strong moral argument. which was basically, if God made all people as people, people should have known people. One thing about a good, clear moral argument is that it doesn't take long to make it. Right? You can understand that pretty quickly. This was their argument. They had been making it and making it piercing sometimes, and they were really getting around by 1850. So what Dabney says in this sort of strategic memo, he says, is just what Byron realized, right, at a different component in history, that if you can hijack the moral narrative, then what happens by default is you persuade people that the folks who are resisting you are somehow anti-God. And I think this is another reason why in this moment, Christians have to be publicly engaged in challenging so-called Christian nationalism, because, I've made a lot of friends trying to teach about this and do this work with secular organizations and the humanists of America, these folks. A lot of them are quite keyed into the fact that there's a theocratic movement in government that would frankly try to use the power of law to get rid of people like them. They get that and they feel it personally. But what I always say to them is, look, I'm not trying to convince you to be a Christian, but I'm in this as a Christian because if we allow the folks, who hijacked the Christian faith to say this is Christianity, then anyone who looks at that and says, I don't want anything to do with that, will have to think, well, I can't be Christian. And frankly, I think that has a lot to do with what we see playing out in the declining numbers of the organized church in the way that we have organized church for generations in this country. Pew runs regular surveys on how people religiously affiliate. And for 2 decades now, folks at Pew say that the fastest growing religious group in the country is the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. I always have to say this is not good news for the monastery. Right? It's not the N-U-N-S. It's the people who, when they're asked, what is your religious affiliation, they don't say Methodist, they don't say Baptist, they don't say Presbyterian, they say Catholic, they say none. Which is not, if you look closer at the data, it's not to say that they didn't grow up in any religious tradition, right? These people were raised in churches. But as adults, they have said, I don't want to be associated with any religious tradition as I've known it in this country. It's interesting that the sort of J curve, the rapid growth of that group, has coincided with the growth of this network that we've been talking about today. And I don't think it's accidental. It is. When you talk to people, the under 40 crowd, which I'll have to admit, I'm not part anymore, but when you talk to younger people, it's pretty clear that people haven't stopped asking the God questions, the big questions about the meaning of life. People haven't even lost their religious impulses. People simply are not wanting to associate with the kinds of Christianity that they've seen. So I think that's one way of saying that our investment in this as Christian people and as churches is as much about the health of the church as it is about the health of the democracy. I simply don't think I'm not trying to say that the church can't exist where there's not democracy. Obviously it has and it does. That's not the point. The point is, in our context, the two have been woven together in such a way that I think, to the extent that the democracy is being diminished by this, the church is equally so.
Quick time check. Are we wrapping up at 4:30? Is everybody good to stay till 4:30? That's not any no's.
It's supposed to go to 4:30, and we're going to have any questions before that.
Yes. Okay, great. So I have one more question for you, Jonathan, and then we're going to take Q&A from both the Zoom, the people who are with us virtually, and people who are here in person. So as Jonathan answers this last question, don't miss this last question. It's a good one. So don't miss it as you're writing down your questions. But if you want to start writing down your questions on the note cards, or you can put them in the chat if you're with us virtually, you can start writing them down, and then we'll ask Jonathan this question. But my last question for you is about the Poor People's Campaign, Fusion Politics, and the work not just in changing the narrative, but actually taking action and bringing together groups to have an alternative. So tell us about the work that you're doing and other kind of innovative ways to build coalitions to have an alternative to this story of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. This story that we've been talking about is one that, frankly, is a little depressing. Do you agree? For 40 years, there's an organized effort with hundreds of millions of dollars that's trying to hijack your faith. How do you feel about that? I mean, it's depressing, both because of the magnitude and danger of what has happened, and because I think when we look at it, it can be very hard to think about an immediate way to overturn it. You can't change cultures overnight, right? So this is not something that we're going to get rid of tomorrow. It's not something that the January 6th Commission or any sort of prosecutions that the Justice Department might carry out is going to resolve. It's simply much bigger than that. But you know, I'm a preacher, and one of the things that I learned from old Martin Luther was that when you dig in, and when he was talking about preaching, when you dig into the text, right? He said it like this in German: only the word that kills can give life. Right? He said when you pay attention to the text, you got to read it close enough to understand how it condemns you in order to find where God saved you. That was his point. I want to suggest as Christians, we have to read the world in a similar way. Right? You have to take the reality that we're up against seriously enough to recognize that we're in a mess that only God can save us from. But if you do that, if you do, I think there's lots of evidence that God is already building the kind of coalition that could offer us a real alternative, both as a church and as a country. And so what I try to do in Revolution of Values is just trace some of the stories of people who are doing that work in order to introduce people to a broader set of organizations and movements. The Poor People's Campaign is certainly one big umbrella organization that is trying to bring those folks together. So if you're not aware, the Poor People's Campaign was relaunched in 2018. Of course, it was founded in 1968 by both Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but in coalition with Cesar Chavez and the welfare rights unions and the Native elders who came together to support it, Chicano workers from the West Coast. It was a very broad coalition of poor and marginalized people who said that they were going to take the sort of moral challenge of extreme poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. They were going to take it to Washington, D.C. and kind of dramatize it in the way that the civil rights movement have been able to dramatize it even more than Jim Crow at lunch counters and similar segregated facilities in the South. And that was the campaign. Then the goal is very much the same today, but because of the 50 years, there's even more issues involved and more organizations. So just last month in Washington, D.C., a coalition, some 400 organizations marched on Pennsylvania Avenue, tens of thousands of people lifting this call, not only to address poverty and racism and ecological devastation and the war economy, but also in the sort of basic call and challenge of the campaign from the very beginning. We've said that religious nationalism has to be challenged by anybody who wants to seriously address these other interlocking injustices. And so it is explicitly a national call for moral revival, and the campaign as a strategy has said to do this work, we have to connect people on the ground who are struggling for justice with faith leaders in their communities. We have to figure out how we can get churches and synagogues and mosques to stand with, the pretty exceptional labor movement that's happening in the country right now. I mean, I don't think the media has covered this sufficiently, but we're in the midst of the largest upsurge in labor organizing in half a century. And, you know, you might have heard about, you know, your local Starbucks organizing or this or that Amazon factory, but there's this huge sector of service work in this country where, you know, if you know anything about just our neighbors who are struggling every day to survive, it's often in service work. You know, it's people who clean the hotels and, you know, take care of folks in their homes and prepare food in restaurants. These are folks who can work, you know, full time every week and still not have enough to just rent an apartment in this town or in any town, frankly. And so building a coalition of moral, religious communities that publicly identify with these justice issues has been the goal of the Morgan campaign. And I think that is the kind of sort of big movement that we need to build. And frankly, after this march, I'll just quote this. It was a moving day to be there because I've visited with and, you know, met so many of these different groups around the country. And so to have everybody in one place at one time, and I was just walking around reading people, and, you know, walked probably 4 or 5 full blocks of Pennsylvania Avenue packed with people. And, you know, on the ground, it's hard to get a sense of exactly, you know, what size group is here. So I was chatting afterwards with some journalists I know who covers up in DC, and I asked this one guy, I said, you know, you cover a lot of these. What would you compare this to? And I was struck that he said, you know, in size, obviously not in message or in makeup of the crowd, but in size, he said this march today was about the size of the March for Life, which is the march that the religious right has organized for decades, an annual march in Washington, D.C., to sort of, you know, galvanize people in this narrative and this organizational network that we've been talking about, to focus on that one thing that they said 50 years ago to bring them all together. And of course, people who believe that story believe that they won a great victory this summer. But at the very same time, what I'm trying to say is that there is just one organizing effort that is bringing together as many people to say we want a different moral narrative in this country. And so I do believe that if we keep connecting and keep building, it is possible not only to build a network that can democratically, you know, build a government that will try to work for everyone, but also build a Christian witness that offers the hope that the people who bear the name of Jesus can actually be about doing some of the things that Jesus was about. Because I've read the Gospels, and you know, Jesus wasn't trying to get people on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe. Jesus wasn't trying to, you know, make sure he had Caesar on his side. Jesus had different priorities. And the thing I love about the Morgan's campaign is that it is rooted in that basic conviction that I think is shared by the Jesus movement. That conviction that the people who have been marginalized and who've been hurt by the systems that exist are the people who are best suited to offer a moral narrative that challenges that. And that was the wisdom of the abolitionist movement. It was the wisdom of the civil rights movement. It was the wisdom of the women's movement. And I think it's what we need today. So that's the revolution of values that I'm invested in, and I hope you will be too.
Thank you. Hold the button down.
No, great. So everyone should have a card. If you need a card, raise your hand. If you have a question for me to pick up, I have a few questions, so I'm going to ask a question, and then after I ask, you just hold yours in the air. I'll walk around and collect whatever questions I see. So we had some questions from online and some from the audience already, and I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to ask a couple, because I think these on the abortion issue, and it shows the complexity of, or the range of thought within the church, and the complexity of that. So one person asked, Do you think that since white men have been fighting for stopping abortion, it's because of their fear of the decline of white people in our society? And someone else asked, is there space in an anti-Christian nationalism movement for people who have strong convictions about abortion not being an ethical option in most situations? So I think we see a few sides there, and we talk a little bit about that. Some of the other questions.
They're good questions. I'll try to be brief since there are a lot of questions. I don't think it's helpful in public debate to say too much about anybody's motives. I've been a pastor for a long time. I know that the Bible is true. The heart is a mysterious thing. People do things for all kinds of reasons. So I'm not out here accusing anybody of, doing something because of some sort of hatred or racism. I'm not trying to say those things don't exist. I'm just saying I don't think it's helpful to say that that's the thing at the front of people's minds. So to that question, I would say the history that I've tried to outline here, I think it's helpful to understand in terms of knowing why coalitions were built and to what ends the people who built the coalitions hope to use them. But obviously these coalitions include millions of people who do things for all kinds of reasons. And so I think if you want to understand people's reasons, you got to talk to them. And most people's reasons for things are pretty complex. So I'm open to that. Now, to the other question of whether a movement that challenges Christian nationalism can include people who ethically don't believe that abortion is right, I sure hope so. Because there are a lot of people who have, I think, legitimate ethical concerns, again, about the very complex decisions that people have to make in particular circumstances. That's always much more complicated than any law can address. But I think it's important to say that that's not what Roe was ever about, and nor is it how Roe was argued. The lawyers who argued Roe said, we are not here to argue for or against abortion. We're here to argue that, one, women's privacy matters in these things, right? The state should not be peering in on people when they're making these kinds of decisions. And two, that this is a decision that because of its complexity and the different sort of points at which people make it, it's a decision that is best made by a mother and her partner or her family and whoever else she decides to consult. And frankly, again, as a Christian minister, I understand that those are conversations that people have in their faith community with faith. So I've had this conversation with people. And again, people have, there's a lot going on in those conversations. So I'm not saying you've got to have any sort of one position on it. And I think, frankly, it's also important to say that the people who are sort of speaking out against Roe, against the overturning of Roe, most strongly and most in the most organized way, I've been talking to them over the last few weeks, and they agree. The leadership of Planned Parenthood is completely on board with this, right? They asked many of us who are faith leaders to make a statement. They said, we don't want you to come out and say you're for abortion. We want you to come out and say that that's not what this is about. And I'm happy to make that statement because I think that's true. And again, this is something that the kind of ethical considerations that people have will be very different across different traditions. Right? If I'm having this conversation with a Muslim imam, it's very different than if I'm having it with a rabbi. Very different when I'm having, a Baptist versus a Catholic. They're just different traditions in which people think about these things. And those are conversations that I think as a people, we should commit to protecting the right for people to have. I think that's what Roe is about. And I think fundamentally, overturning Roe was never about, in the crudest sense, saving babies, which is the language that has been used by the religious right. My understanding, and I'm not saying that people who are part of the pro-life movement and genuinely wanted to overturn Roe did not believe that they were trying to say. I know enough people to know absolutely. That's why they've been in it. And I know enough people in that world to know that they are genuinely committed to trying, sort of now that they feel like they've won their victory, they're committed to trying to, they'll say it this way, make life easier for mothers and children that are born into this world. They feel like energized to do that work. And I don't in any way question the genuineness of that commitment. I simply have to say that I do not see in this country how that can be a political reality. Because the very coalition that you bound yourself with to overturn this law is the coalition of people that have politically tried to strip every social program or family leave policy or, affordable housing, affordable, child care policy from public life. So I don't think that I will challenge folks in that sense on their kind of belief that you can privately provide those things through little, church-funded efforts, where you still are more or less trying to impose your view on other people. I do think that that's a part of Christian nationalism that we need to challenge. But to the question, no, I don't think that that you have to sort of make some sort of ethical declaration about abortion in order to say that we have a right to privacy and a right to determine our own health care in this country, which is my understanding of what Rose says.
Thank you. I'm going to have a couple questions here that are a little closer to home. What would you like to see in Durham community to unite for the common good? And earlier you talked about some of the problems in Durham being possible to solve on the local level. You mentioned like housing, healthcare. I don't know if gun violence would be in that list of problems, but are there things we can or should be doing as a group of people from Durham who have come together for this particular place?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, I believe that our local commitment to be the kind of community we want to be possible everywhere is just a primary reality for Christian people. So, if my sort of call for us to address the systemic issues earlier, highlighted the fact that those things we do day in and day out to try to love our neighbors are not sufficient. Don't hear me saying that they're not necessary. They're not only necessary for the sake of our neighbors, they're necessary for our own sake. I want to hold on to my soul in frankly, a society that is often soulless, right? I live in a country in which one senator used his power last year to guarantee that 4 million children would go back into poverty. And I did everything I could to persuade him he was wrong, and I couldn't persuade him. I wasn't doing that alone. Billions of people were here and they couldn't persuade him. We could not persuade him. Not in his office, not from the dinghies outside his yacht. We couldn't do it anywhere. Not standing outside his coal plant in West Virginia. We could not persuade him. And I'm a nonviolent brother. I leave my means of persuasion at the nonviolent means. I'm not trying to say, we should do anything else. But given that I could not persuade him, I want to be committed to replacing him and others who also would not do that. And since that's not going to happen today or tomorrow, I also want to figure out in a society like this, how do we hold on to our soul? If we know the people who represent us made a decision that put 4 million children back into poverty, what am I going to do for the kid on my block who I know is in poverty? Because I talked to his mom, I know they don't have enough to eat, so what am I going to do today? What are we going to do, with what we have as churches, as community groups? I see some of you in this room who've sat at the table in my whole community where we have a, food ministry, where we've watched these last few years, the demand just shoot up. Is the local food ministry sufficient to overcome the problem of hunger? No, it's never going to be. But we sure better be committed to it, because not only do we, do what we can to meet an immediate need, but we learn something in that space about who's impacted, how it's impacting us, how it's impacting the community, and where we can build together. I'll just say, in addition to this, try to build a bridge, that one of the things I've been most encouraged by here in Durham, and again, this is not to say it's only happening, it's just what I've observed because I've been involved with the Poor People's Campaign, is that the Poor People's Campaign launched in the midst of the pandemic a food ministry out of the parking lot over at Lakewood. I don't know if anybody's been involved, but it's called Fed Up. And what I love about it from the very beginning is that Fed Up just started getting food, buying food, getting food from food banks, whatever, getting food and getting it to people who needed food. But they also said, this isn't a problem that's solved by one bag of food. So while you're here getting your food, can we tell you about this movement that you can be part of, right? So it's meeting an immediate need and organizing at the same time. Believing in the agency of the people who are in need. Because what the church can sometimes do is we can turn our charity work into something that kind of reinforces some of our more condescending tendencies.
Yeah.
The whole those poor people, if only they had made better decisions, or if only they had done this or that, they might not need this food. Or maybe they're doing more than you or I might say. They've heard. I said, I've heard. Maybe they're working a lot harder than me, but their work isn't being compensated in a way that allows them to feed their family. Now that's something, if we could agree on, that we work together to change. So it's kind of using that relationship as a grounds for organizing. That's what Fed Up is about. And I think those kinds of projects are the ones that can be most fruitful to connect those two things that you questioned, or rose the question about. Thank you.
Okay, we probably just have time for more questions. So since I have a handful of questions, I'm trying to bring a bunch together here. And I think this relates to what you're saying. Someone asked for encouraging examples of Christians or churches addressing giving alternatives to Christian nationalism. But then there were also some questions that were really about the state of the church. So ongoing segregation in the churches around us, and also churches that are full of diverse political opinions. People who are going to vote Republican or Democrat, and there's independents. And so these questions about how do you, what's the unifying message? And where are we free to disagree or vote differently? How do we provide a viable alternative if, right, so we talked a little bit about the religious right, it had a very clear, singular message.
Yeah.
So in the midst of honoring diversity and trying to work across differences, what does that look like for those of us in church?
I always appreciate the Christian commitment to unity. Jesus prayed that we might be one as he and the Father were one. But that's a mystery. The Trinity is a mystery to me, it's a mystery to the church. I don't understand it. That's a sincere prayer to join. So to want unity and to be committed to working for it, I think is the work of the church. I believe we make a mistake in the context of the history and culture that we've discussed here today if we believe that the best unity we can work for is a kind of least common denominator unity with other people who call themselves Christian. I do not think this is the time to say Well, at least we have in common with the Christian nationalists who stormed the Capitol that we all love Jesus. I just don't know that it serves any helpful purpose for them or for us, or especially for the people who are most vulnerable in this country. Rather than that kind of least common denominator unity, I would encourage us to work for what St. Augustine called unity in the fundamentals. I'm going to talk about fundamentalism and everything. I'm talking about the basic things that are true to the Christian story. We have inherited a long tradition that has been lived in different contexts, in different times in history, by people with very different relationships with those who are in power in this complex history. But all throughout that history, the tradition we've inherited has tried to love our neighbors and work for justice in public. We've tried to do that. Done it very poorly sometimes, had some shining examples of other times. That's what we've tried to do, that's what we've said we try to do in every place, in every time. I'd like to build some unity around that, right? But with all the Christians, or frankly, with anybody who's of any persuasion, but as a Christian, I want to build unity around this commitment to loving our neighbors and to working for justice, especially for the people who are crying out because they can't survive. And I think if our worship as a church and our practice of the Christian faith doesn't tune our ears to hear those cries and to respond to them, then I suspect we have, I'm not saying we're not Christian, but I suspect we have been influenced by something other than Christianity. If we can't hear the cry for justice as a cry that God hears. So let's build unity around that. That would be my answer. And there are lots of people doing that in Durham. And so this coalition of work being one of them. So let's give thanks for that, and let's join up with everybody we can. Because the cries are not getting quieter, at least in my corner of town. And so I think it means that there's still work to be done.
Let's have another hand for Denise is going to come and close this with some final remarks and close this in prayer. Yeah, very final remarks.
Want to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon. I have some things I have to think about that our brother brought up, for us and with us today. Some very definite questions that I hope have also put some food for thought in your hearts, in your minds, because these are very trying times. Would you agree with me? These are very trying times, very thought-provoking times. And I think the one thing that is always present in my mind is, as a Christian, how do I look at it? In voter suppression, how do I look at it? With Roe versus Wade, how do I look at it? There are so many issues. And one thing I wanted to add to what the brother said today is the one thing that kind of stays on my mind is not only the unity, but what would Jesus do? And I think that's the thing that kind of guides me. Not always what the Bible says, because sometimes we interpret the Bible very differently than what Jesus may have meant. But definitely, what would Jesus do? So that has even provoked my thought even more about all that is going on. But since I'm kind of tying things up, I just want to thank everyone, both our virtual audience, and I don't know, does anybody know how many virtual people are out there?
Around 60.
Well, okay, so we almost have as many people virtually as we do who are here today. So that is wonderful. So I want to thank our virtual guests for coming out today and sharing this time with us. And most of all, those of you who decided to come in person. Personally, I told them I'm sick of Zoom. I like to see people, touch people, you know, and all that. So it's wonderful. But I'm glad we're able to do a hybrid thing. But I want to thank you all for coming out. I again want to thank Reverend Banks and the Epworth family for allowing us to take up this space today to talk about this. You know, it's very crucial, and you know, it has been a great afternoon. Again, I want to thank my brothers, Reverend Reynolds Chapman and Reverend Wilson-Hartgrove, to share this time with us, to give us, as I said, some things to think about, and definitely your call to action. That we need to come together, we need to unify, and we need to know and be Christians. That's what the Lord said. He said, you know, they know us by our what? Love. They know us by our love. So yes, so again, thank you for coming out. Hopefully, as Reverend Van Wood had mentioned earlier, there are books. Reverend Hargrove's most recent book that he is graciously giving to us this afternoon. So if you'd like to get a copy of this book, and I didn't get mine signed. Is that they are outside on the table. So again, thank you for coming out. Have a wonderful afternoon. And hopefully you'll see us again in some of our upcoming events. I know we've got a book, a book reading coming up. So hopefully we have your information and we can share that with you when that time comes. Yes, ma'am.
Visit our website.
Excuse me?
Visit our website.
I can't hear you.
Ask if they want to visit our website. Encourage
Oh, yes. I don't have it set. Oh, it's right up there. So information about what we're doing, what we have done, and what is upcoming. You can click onto that little QR code that I can never do. Okay, but that is also that's our website. So if you're interested in joining us and finding out more about what the partnership does, please feel free to check us out on our website. Okay. Thank you.